Hello, my name is Justin Rempel. Welcome to this first installment in a series on meter in poetry. In part one, we're going to take a look at some basic concepts, the building blocks that make up meter, and what we mean when we're talking about meter in poetry. So first of all, we have to think about definitions. What is meter? Meter is a way of measuring rhythm in poetry. So just like we would measure heights or weights or speed or anything else, we can measure patterns and rhythms in poetry. And it tells us something about how that poetry is built. Meter is a pattern of syllables, is a good way of thinking about it. So poetry that has a meter, we call metered poetry. Sometimes metered poetry has a rhyme, but it doesn't have to. Some metered poetry is unrhymed. We call that blank verse. And it's important to remember that not all poetry is metered. Poetry that does not have a meter we call free verse. And most modern poetry is free verse. So if we're measuring poetry, what are our units of measurement? Well, they're called feet. So one unit is called a foot, and more than one is called feet. And this is how we measure the patterns and the rhythms of poetry. So different lines are named for how many feet they have in them. So if you have a line that's 1 foot long, we call that type of poetry monometer. Okay, if we have a line of poetry that's 2 feet long, we call that dimeter. If we have a line of poetry that's 3 feet long, we call that trimeter. 4 feet long, that type of poetry is called tetrameter. A 5 foot line of poetry is called pentameter. A 6 foot line of poetry is called hexameter, and a 7 foot line of poetry is called heptameter. And you could go on, you could go into 8 feet, 9 feet, but typically lines don't get much longer than 7 feet long because they don't fit on the page anymore. It's too long. And once you get that long, you really start to lose the feel of the flow. So it's very rare to see, even hexameter or heptameter is not that common. Stress. So there's different types of feet, and the difference is based on which syllable has the emphasis. So we use a few different terms when we're talking about emphasis. We might call it stress, we might call it accent. It's the syllable that has the most oomph behind it, right? The greatest stress falls on it. So for example, in the word thermometer, you can hear that there's a heavy emphasis on the second syllable, mom, thermometer, okay? 4 syllables, thermometer, but the second one has the stress or emphasis or accent, thermometer. And stress is really important when we're measuring meter because it's what gives it a rhythm. Some syllables get the emphasis, some don't. And the difference between those types is what makes different kinds of feet. We're going to get that, those differences, we'll get into that a lot more in our next video.